Now let us open our Bibles to the Gospel of Luke, chapter 1, verses 26 through 38. Luke chapter 1, verses 26 through 38. In your pew Bible, it is on page 831. In the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent by God to a town in Galilee called Nazareth, to a virgin engaged to a man whose name was Joseph, of the house of David. The virgin's name was Mary. And he came to her and said, "Greetings, favored one, the Lord is with you." But she was much perplexed by his words and pondered what sort of greeting this might be. And the angel said to her, "Do not be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God. And now you will conceive in your womb and bear a son, and you will name him Jesus. He will be great, and he will be called Son of the Most High, and the Lord God will give him the throne of his ancestor David. He will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end." Mary said to the angel, "But how can this be, since I am a virgin?" The angel said to her, "The Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. Therefore the child to be born will be holy, and he will be called Son of God. And now your relative Elizabeth in her old age has also conceived a son, and this is her 6th month. This is the 6th month for her who was said to be barren. For nothing will be impossible for God." Then Mary said, "Here I am, the servant of the Lord. Let it be according to your word." Then the angel departed. The word of the Lord. This is an interesting story, isn't it? It comes to us at a time after all of the prophets had prophesied in the Old Testament, after everything had been said, after generation upon generation had been waiting for the one to come. Now we see that here in this little town of Nazareth, this young lady, Mary, gets a visit from an angel, fulfilling the prophecy that the Son of God, that God incarnate, would be born of a virgin. All of the Old Testament is weighing on all of the people of God to this point, as they have waited since the Exodus from Egypt, since the fall of Israel, since all that had happened to them, since the prophet Isaiah had spoken of the suffering servant, since Isaiah spoke about Emmanuel, since all of the prophets had spoken of the one to come. So imagine the weight that was upon her. Imagine how when she heard this, growing up a good Jewish girl, she knew the stories, and she probably understood what it meant that she was chosen to be the one to bear this baby. I would almost call it like a mission impossible for her. Mary, you have been chosen by God. You who are a young virgin, engaged to a man named Joseph. You who have never been with a man herself, who have kept herself pure. You are hereby called to give birth to a baby who will be called the Son of God, who will be God himself. If you choose this impossible mission, the Lord shall envelop you, and you shall bear the baby that is to be called the Son of the Most High, Emmanuel, God with us, Prince of Peace. He shall be God among humanity. This message will self-destruct in 5 seconds. Talk about your mission impossible. Here she was, an innocent young lady, a teenager, no more than 13 or 14, promised to a man who was probably at least twice her age. So he was at least in his 20s, maybe in his 30s. Here she was who had made sure that she kept herself cleansed, kept herself pure, never did anything to really affect her purity. And this angel comes to her and says, "You are the chosen one." And what is she to say? How is she to respond to this? How is she to respond to an angel appearing and saying, "You are the chosen one"? How would you react? Here, after hearing what the angel has to say, she realizes that it is God who is calling her. She realizes that it is God who has chosen her. She realizes that God has made her to bear this burden, this person, this being within her. But yet, as we read this, so many of us have this context of, it's okay because it's a story of out there. But how often do we respond to the call? Here was Mary accepting this impossible mission. And she said, "Here I am." But yet for many of us, we often feel that God is just out of reach. God may say, "I want you to move forward," but we decide to stay still. God may inspire you to do something, to sing something, to reach out to someone, but we decide maybe that's just because I want to, or I thought so, I won't do that. How do we respond to the call that God places on our life? How do you respond to the call that God places on your life? Do you make excuses to not do it? Oftentimes, whenever someone pops into my head, I try to make sure to pray for them, to pray with them, to let them know that I am praying with them. Because we don't know why God has placed someone in our hearts or minds. If God has inspired us to do something, if God has gifted us with something, whether to sing or to be an administrator or to be able to raise funds or to be able to reach out to people, when we don't use those gifts, when we don't respond to God's call, there are people who are being affected. If we think about Mary, what happens if Mary decides, "I am not good enough, I'm not going to do this"? Was there another? Imagine this burden. Would you be willing to take this burden upon you? This was a young lady, someone who had barely begun living her life, and she received a call that was not only going to change her life, it was not only going to change the life of her and her fiancé. It was not only going to change the family life and dynamic, it was going to change the whole world for millennia to come. The child that you bear will be called Son of the Most High. Wow. How big is that call? And yet for us, something as simple as asking someone to collect offering, they might say no because they're embarrassed to get up in front of people, or you feel like you want to talk to someone because God is calling you to, but yet you don't do it because of one reason or another, or your gifts are being wasted because you're too shy or too afraid, or something happened one day so many years ago to someone else that you don't want it to happen to you, that you decide not to do it and not to follow and not to allow God to use you as God's instrument. How do you do that? How do you live with yourself? How do you get up every morning knowing that you have denied yourself the blessing that God has for you? How? When God has placed a call upon our life, when God has placed a call upon our being, when God inspires you to do and to be something, it is a hard thing to deny. Because yes, someone else might be able to do the work, but God called you first. There's a reason why God calls us. It's not just so that the work can get done. More importantly, it is the special and unique way and perspective that each of us brings. We are all different and we all see things differently, and God calls us because our perspective, our way of seeing things, our way of possibly organizing and inspiring is different than what another will bring. So it's not only about the work to get done, it is about the person being called to it. God could have called so many other young ladies at this time. They all kept to the purity and trying to stay pure and cleansed and not do things in a bad or difficult way. But it was because Mary was who she was that God called her. When God calls you, he calls you because of who you are. Though you may feel that God is not as close as you would like God to be, but how often have you tried to get closer to God? Maybe we are always reaching out for God, but moving away. So God is always just barely away from us. Rather than running away, maybe if we ran towards. Rather than running away, maybe if we embraced. Rather than running away, what if we responded like Mary responded when she said, "Here I am." She listened to what the angel had to say. She heard the difficulty that it was going to cause, because I'm sure she calculated immediately. She said, okay, I'm engaged, but we haven't had sex. And we're not going to have sex until after the wedding. But the wedding doesn't happen for a certain amount of days or maybe a month. So then we won't do anything until then. But then I might be a month pregnant by the time we do have sex, and then people are going to try to figure out, and you can imagine what was going through her mind. But she knew that she was risking being kicked out of the community, being abandoned by the man she was engaged to, and more so being stoned, because this wasn't the modern age that we think of today where there are a lot of single moms. She risked being killed because she knew that God had called her to bear this burden and blessing. She was willing to risk it, even though she calculated, even though she figured out that people would probably question the timing of Jesus' birth. Even though she knew all of these things, her response to the angel was, "Here I am." Now, this is something major. Why is it so difficult for us to respond to God with "Here I am"? Something as simple as say, "Hey, would you like to sing in the choir?" Why is it so difficult for us to say, "Here I am"? If it's something where God is calling you to inspire the church, but yet you refuse to, why is it so difficult to say, "Here I am"? We'd rather say, "Well, there you go. Oh yeah, you can speak. Yeah, you should be able to do that." We try to inspire others so that we don't have to do it, but God is calling you. Why is it so difficult for you to say, "Here I am"? 3 simple words. And the amazing thing is that in the midst of just being able to respond to that, to just say, "Here I am," so many doors open. And we come to the crossway of mercy and grace. We come to that path and just know that it was the right choice because God is in control. Why is it so difficult to say, here I am? Mary knew the consequences of what she was doing. She knew that people would talk because people always talk. You know that. But she knew that her call was greater than people talking, than people gossiping, than people complaining, than people looking at her and looking at her son, and talking out both sides of their mouth. She knew that what God had called her to was greater than the sum of all of those things. That is your call today, to realize that what God is calling you to is greater than all of the things that people will say, all of the things that people might talk about or gossip about or whatever. God's call to your life is greater than all of those things combined, because God's mercy, God's grace, and most importantly, God's love abides within us, around us, and continues to bless us each day if we are willing to say, here I am. So what is your response today to God's call in your life? Are you willing to say, here I am? Or will you continue to say, I've already done it? Or maybe this other person should do it. Or I don't have the energy. I used to have the energy, but now I don't. We're loaded with excuses. We can make excuses for days. But if we just stop for a moment, and instead of making an excuse, we just said, Lord, here I am. You might change the lives of more people than you can imagine. This young girl in Nazareth heard what was her calling, and she knew the consequences. And yet she responded to God with, here I am. May we in this morning and henceforth, when we hear the call of God, when we feel God calling us, may we respond to God, here I am.